Look, I know this review is a bit late, but Edgar Wright directed his very first straight-up horror movie, so I am actually obligated by law to talk about it. I'm sorry, but I don't make the rules. Throughout his career, director Edgar Wright has been one to really mix up genres in his films. He's made action comedies, sci-fi comedies, and of course horror comedies with Shaun of the Dead, and though he has made, in many fans' eyes, one of the best, if not the best, zombie movies of all time with that film, Wright has never made a straight-up horror movie. And upon his announcing that this film was going to be his next project, I was absolutely thrilled, and not just because I'm a huge fan of horror, but I was very curious to see the type of film that he would make. Because Edgar Wright has such a vast breadth of knowledge and is such a true scholar and fan of film history that I just knew that his next film was going to be this blend of icons and titans of horror. And that is exactly what we get in Last Night in Soho. It's this kind of Neapolitan ice cream of a movie, because there are shades of those Italian giallo filmmakers with, of course, Argento and Fulci and Bava, but also the American influences of that movement too, with people like Brian De Palma. And it's not just a case of, oh, this movie is colorful and it's horror, so it's giallo. No, the entire conceit of this movie, the characters, subject matter, the violence, the location, all of it is this real remixing of what one would expect in a movie like Deep Red and Inferno, but also other horror classics too, like Repulsion. I think on the whole, results may vary for people on this movie, because for some, this film may lean on the side of homage, which is almost like a dirty word in Hollywood, or some may see it as an influence. And I think a good way to think about the distinction between the two is with a filmmaker like Quentin Tarantino or Martin Scorsese. And I guess it really is a personal preference, if anything, how you feel the director is kind of tipping their hand to what influences their decisions in their films. For myself, I really do think that Edgar Wright is able to implement his own style here in a way that, for better or worse, does feel modern and very much him. This isn't a movie like The Love Witch, for example, a movie that feels like you're watching a film that actually came out in the era that it's supposed to represent. Instead, this really does feel like this remixing of sorts. The soundtrack alone gives this movie this very modern sensibility, despite the fact that most of, if not all of the songs in this soundtrack are oldies, from like the 1950s and the 1960s. He is being influenced by the giallo films, but it's not necessarily a carbon copy of them. The style and the way that he uses modern technology and modern even camera movements and the style of this movie, it's influenced by the past, but it's not entirely representative of the past. And beyond just the style of this film, which it has in spades, there is a real attempt made here to give this movie sort of a modern facelift, if you will, because the narrative going on here is one that is very contemporary, especially considering the subject matter and the narratives that one would expect from a film of the giallo era. But despite the fact that there is an attempt made, I think that's really where this movie started to fall apart for myself, because this movie tries to tell the story of generational trauma. We're in an era where it is much more, I guess, acceptable in a way, or at least in the eyes of society. Women have a bit more credibility when it comes to coming forth about violence and past sexual assault and other similar crimes. And there really seems to be a discussion being had here in this film where it's talking about, just because these horrible things happened 50 to 60 years ago, that doesn't just make it okay. Justice and healing still need to happen. And despite the fact that message is still there, this film also communicates some other messages that are seemingly unintentional regarding this issue specifically. It really is impossible to discuss without going into spoilers, so unfortunately I have to keep it pretty vague. But I think on the whole, this idea is approached with seemingly good intentions, but its execution results in something that felt really misguided and kind of sloppily handled. While the fault doesn't entirely fall on Edgar Wright's feet, considering he co-wrote this script, something that does fall on his feet more is how this film handles the execution of its horror. And like I mentioned previously, Edgar Wright is such a big horror fan, and his knowledge about film history and filmmaking, it's ridiculous. Which is why I found it so unfortunate that the scares this movie has to offer were really kind of pedestrian in a way, and ordinary. There is a real lack and an unfortunate lack of variety happening here with the scares in this movie. And a lot of them are just kind of going to the same well. Again, can't talk too much about it without going into spoilers, but Wright has a certain tactic that he uses a lot in this movie, and he just kind of keeps going back to that. There isn't a lot of versatility happening here, which I found kind of shocking, and not in a good way. I think one thing is certain about this movie, and really a lot of Edgar Wright's films, is this really strong sense of style and pace with these movies. Wright doesn't make boring films or visually uninteresting films. That's never been the problem, because this movie has very complicated shots that seem like they require a ton of planning and timing and rehearsal to execute. They're very impressive, which I do think is something that could be appreciated upon further rewatches. But the unfortunate reality of it all is that none of that truly matters very much if the story you're telling doesn't work. Because there are elements here that I think really do communicate this clear sense of intention. There are a lot of, unfortunately, more components to this movie that honestly just really do not come together for me. That paired with the fact that, as I said, this movie has some pretty run-of-the-mill attempts at horror made for an honestly kind of disappointing experience, because I really was expecting so much more from Edgar Wright. So did you guys see Last Night in Soho? Where does it rank for you in regards to Edgar Wright's other films? I'd love to know, so make sure you let me know down in the comments below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching today. I hope you liked today's video, and if you did, you can click on the link down below where you can subscribe to my channel to see more movie reviews and movie related things. Again, guys, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.